And I like to joke with Bree and with Strategist when I spend time with them that if they could have gone back in time 5 years, they could have given Bree and all his friends a job and a free 3D printer and saved $405 million. But that's the world we live in. And I think it's an incredible, incredible time to be alive, right? You think about what's possible today for the average person, the average entrepreneur, and it's an incredible difference from what we're used to seeing. There's really 3 things that are different. The first is that we have much better access. So as you see in this picture here, this is Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of Intel. And he has this Moore's law that most people have heard about, which is that the amount of power you can put on a computing chip, or really any exponential technology, will double every 18 months at the same price. And so every 18 months, everything we're using is getting twice as good, give or take, at the same price point. And the effect is that essentially every single one of you has in your pocket a computer that is stronger than what took us to the moon. And what do you do with it? You look at pictures of cats, right? Because it's surplus power. It's so much computing power, so much information, so much access that we don't even know what to do with it. And as a result, there are now more mobile phones in the world than there are people. There are now more people learning to code than ever before. There's more information created every year than in the prior years, right? So we have this sort of massive explosion of what people are able to get access to, what they're able to use, such that a gentleman in Brooklyn can reinvent a 3D printer in his spare time. That's the world we live in. The second issue is that there are better platforms. And what I mean by platforms are things that other people, other businesses can use to build their business, right? So if you think about it, you build a product, and it's very interesting, it's very successful. Maybe you build something internally for your own use, but then suddenly it has value to someone else. And in the old world, in a world that didn't change very fast, the platforms that we built could only be used linearly. When you build this Carousel du Louvre, there can only be one conference in this room at any given time. Can't have 2 conferences in here, it would be chaos, right? But when you build something like Amazon Web Services, a cloud data storage tool, that can be used by millions of people at the same time. And so all the work that's being created by these startups, by these entrepreneurs, now becomes platform for the next entrepreneur, for the next startup to use. And that's a really powerful idea because it creates this ladder, this ability to stand on the shoulders of everyone around us. And the third issue is that we have better networks than ever before. So again, thinking about how things used to be, we didn't used to be connected. Then it was the railroad, then it was the airplane. Suddenly the internet comes along, then mobile phones. Now the Internet of Things comes along, and we start to think about not just people being connected on Facebook and LinkedIn, et cetera, but actually things being connected. That my air conditioner talks to my light, which talks to my door lock, which talks to the energy company, and tells each other things to do to optimize my experience, right? All those networks are there. And as a result, you get this phenomenon where if you have a great idea, you can build it and test it easier than ever before. And if it actually is a great idea, it will spread across the network faster than ever before. I like to talk to audiences to say, if we just all said, you know what, let's not do the conference today, let's invent the next great app. There is no reason, no friction in the world preventing us from having an app with 100 million users tonight. The only thing stopping that from happening is that the app we would develop probably wouldn't be that good. But if it was that good, it would spread, and it would spread, it could spread almost at an unlimited pace. And that's just a very different reality that now businesses can grow and scale in new ways. So I want to talk about Uber for a second. It's a touchy subject. I actually don't want to talk about Uber as like, oh, Uber's so amazing, and I don't want to talk about Uber as, oh, Uber's so terrible. All I want to talk about is this. What did Uber invent? Think about that for a second. They didn't invent GPS. They didn't invent cars. They didn't invent livery services. They didn't invent the App Store or apps or iOS. They didn't invent the language that they wrote the code in, right? All they invented was this very thin layer between people who need a ride and people who have a car and put the two together and take out some of the friction. Very thin layer. Probably 1% of the total value that you get when you ride in an Uber was actually created by them. Everything else was already there. All the platforms, all the networks were right there waiting. And just by capitalizing on that last 1%, a $40 billion business is born. And even if that's too much, maybe we're in a bubble. Let's call it 20 billion, or 10, or 5. Doesn't matter. It's still a crazy successful outcome for a 5-year-old company by just creating that thin layer. So that's the power of the access, the platforms, the networks that we have. Here's the impact, right? So now we look and we say, okay, how many years does it take for a company to reach $1 billion in valuation or capitalization? Well, the average Fortune 500, the answer is somewhere around 20. And then you have Google, and now it's 8. And then it's Facebook, and now it's 6. And Tesla, and Uber, and Snapchat, and Oculus Rift. I'm not a mathematician, but does anyone see the pattern? It's heading towards some very scary low number, some sub-year number that says you can build $1 billion in value in a very short amount of time. And that creates interesting pressures on the world around us. So here's the thing. At the same time as it's the most incredible time to be alive because you can do anything, it's also the most complex and complicated and uncertain time to be alive. If you think about what's going on here, there's more competition, there's more information, there's more volatility than ever before. Because it's so easy to compete. It's so easy to get information. It's so easy to be thrown by something that changes. The price of oil changes, and suddenly thousands of companies are trying to react because there's volatility in the system. Or we have a day on the stock exchange where the algorithms freak out and nobody knows why, and the stocks dip and then they jump back up again, and we literally can't even explain what happened. We live in a world where there's so much interconnectedness and so much information power that it's hard to predict what will happen next. And in fact, you could argue that it's impossible to predict what will happen next. And that creates pressure. What astounds me and what I work on every day is the fact that amidst all that change, all that tumult, all that innovation, one thing has stayed the same. One thing has stayed remarkably unremarkable, and that's our organizations. The organizations that most of us work in, the biggest companies in the world, more or less run exactly the same way as they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. In some cases, they run the same way they did 100 years ago, right? Because we haven't changed the very nature of what we do. And it's a crime because we spend more than half our lives there. We spend more than half our lives at work, and yet the way we work, the way we organize, the way we come together is essentially the same as it has been since before the invention of the computer. And that's changed everything. So how can the organizations not change as well? They haven't, and it's started to do us a disservice. The first data point is that, by and large, most people are not happy at work. So this is about 17.5% of the workforce. This is US data, although I've actually looked at the French data, and it's not too dissimilar. Actively disengaged, meaning I'm so unhappy at work that I am actively fighting against what we're doing. I'm looking for another job, or I'm trying to sabotage something, or I'm actively not caring. And then you have 51% of people who are just disengaged. They're just showing up. They go to the meeting. They don't care. It's just, they just work to live. They want to get home to the kids, get home to the game, right? So there you have 68% of everybody at work not rowing the boat. And then what's left in the green are the people that are engaged, right? That are actually plugged in, that are excited about where they work, that are excited about what they're doing, that really show up. And that's a huge issue because it's not as if we have everything figured out. We have global issues, political issues, issues of inequality, issues of environmental sustainability, issues of innovation that need our best work, and yet we can't even show up to get it done. There's another impact of all the trends we just talked about. And that is that it is much, much harder to stay big for very long. So in 1958, if you were on the S&P 500, which is one of the biggest indexes of large, important companies in the world, you would be on there about 60 years, which is an incredible long run. 60 years of being one of the biggest and the best. That is just like, get out the cigar, sit back in your leather chair, and enjoy that success. You don't have to work for that. Now look at this. Globalization happens. Connectivity happens. Computers happen. The world changes, and suddenly we're sitting in a place where today the average is more like 15 years that you're going to be on that list before you fall off. And even that is skewed because there are companies on there like GE that have been on the list for 122 years. So the actual reality, the actual point of fact, is that every 5 years, half of those 500 companies will change going forward. 50%. Look to your left, look to your right. One of you will not be here in 5 years. That's what we're talking about. It's crazy. So it's really hard to stay big amidst all this change and pressure. And when I tell that to CEOs, they say, yes, we feel that. We know we need to change. We know we need to get out in front of this.